Hello everyone, I am Balquell, and welcome to my Pleasure Dome. Welcome to the HD era of Balquell's books. This is being broadcast in 1080p using the latest technology available to broadcasters of video. And to celebrate this new technology and being on the cutting edge of all things scientific, technological, and cultural, we are traveling 206 years in the past to read a novel entitled Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin. Charles Maturin is described on the back of my edition, which is right here, and you can see in HD. You can see all the details of this strange ritual being performed on the cover. He is described on the back of this book as an eccentric Anglican curate, which is really a description we can all aspire to. And this is actually a very important 3 words. However, this description is missing one more important word that it will be relevant to discussion of this particular title, and that word is Irish. So Charles Maturin is an eccentric Irish Anglican curate. And if you know anything about Ireland, you might know that Ireland has a sort of cultural divide, a very prominent cultural and political divide between Protestants and Catholics, which has led to much conflict in the past, with Catholics being the majority and Anglican is the Church of England, members of the Church of England, which is a Protestant church. And this is very important when we think about the nature of this novel and why Charles Maturin wrote it in the way that he did. Now, being a curate, you will not be surprised to find that this novel deals with religious issues. Particularly, this novel is concerned with salvation and with the social organization of faith. In many respects, this is a book about Catholicism. However, when we consider that this book is about Catholicism, written by a Anglican Protestant clergy member, we have to realize that the view of Catholicism we're going to get will not be altogether accurate. It will be not a particularly generous view, and in fact we will learn a lot more about Protestantism than Catholicism from this exercise. This book is very accurately described as anti-Catholic. And we'll get into that as we go. So what is the nature of Melmoth the Wanderer? Well, Melmoth the Wanderer is a man named Melmoth, and he does a little bit of wandering. He has been, not cursed, he made a deal with the devil at some point outside of the text. He made a deal with the devil, which allows him to live for 150 years, which is a bit longer than most people will live. It also gives him the power to cover vast distances in lickety-split times, and he basically uses this power to go to Ireland, Spain, and India. Those are kind of the 3 places he tends to go. We don't really see him go anywhere else. And what he's doing in his wandering is he is attempting to tempt other people to sort of join him in his sort of cursed life. So obviously when you make a deal with the devil, what you are offering is your soul. And when you're done with the deal, you will go to hell for eternity. And you have forsaken salvation, which normally, according to Christian doctrine, is available, to everybody else. Hypothetically, to varying degrees depending on who you believe. Anyway, he has obviously forsaken all this, and he's a bit bummed about it, but also, he did it on purpose, so it's hard to tell exactly how bummed about it he is. Maybe we'll get into that a little later. So, a good question is, why is he in Spain? And I mean, you might not ask that. You might just accept that he's in Spain, but there's a good reason he's in Spain. For especially for British Protestants of the era, this is the early 1800s, Spain was considered sort of the antithesis to England, at least. Not only is it a Catholic country, but it's a very repressive country. The the Spanish Inquisition is still ongoing. Anyone who does not subscribe to the particular brand of Catholicism that is favored by the elites is basically screwed and will be either killed or, what do you call it? Deported, exiled, banished, whatever you want to say. So Charles Maturin is intentionally using this country and this area in order to provide a contrast with his particular religious beliefs. And a lot of this has to do with the social organization of faith. To cast a very broad, use a very broad brush, we can say that for Protestants, generally, the focus is on a personal, an individual relationship with God that is not, is in certain ways mediated by the church, but is meant to be direct. So you can make direct prayers and create your own relationship with God. Whereas in Catholicism, there is the mediation of the Catholic Church, which is the sort of domain of God on earth, right? And this mediation, this sort of political control of the Catholic Church is particularly what Charles Maturin is unhappy with. So the structure of this story is actually, it's kind of bizarre, kind of weird. Essentially, it is a series of nested frame stories in which Melmoth will appear as a sort of shadowy antagonist, but none of them are specifically focused on Melmoth's story. He is appearing in other people's stories, and as it goes on, we get more of an idea of Melmoth himself as a person, though he always remains enigmatic, ambiguous, kind of a shadowy figure that we have to sort of piece together. You never get a sort of complete picture of his personal nature. This structure is not particularly well put together, we can say. There are several stories that nest into each other, so I guess I'll describe a few of them. The book starts with a man named Melmoth, not the Wanderer Melmoth, but a different Melmoth, a relation of his, who goes to visit his rich uncle, and while he's there, he gets introduced to the Melmoth sort of legend, which is this sort of ancient, this sort of ancestor of his from, 100 and so ever years ago, who is reported to still be wandering around and has not aged, and there's this sort of frightening portrait of him in the house. This younger Melmoth meets a Spanish sailor, and this Spanish sailor tells him of his story, and then during that story, the sailor encounters other stories that he's telling, and these stories lead to another story, and so on and so on. In all, there's like 5 or 6 stories that end up sort of nesting within each other, and at the end of the book, we sort of have to burst back out of all of them all of a sudden. It's quite a jarring ending, and you can say that the story of the Spanish sailor himself never really concludes. The Melmoth the Wanderer sort of shows up at the end, and we have to take a step back from all these stories and deal with him in the present day. There are 2 stories that I think are particularly interesting that we'll cover in our show today. These are the original story of the Spanish sailor and a story of a young woman named Emily. So the Spanish sailor is the illegitimate child of a mother and a father, as is often the case. They do end up having legitimate children later, It's not a sort of mistress situation. But since he is born out of wedlock or whatever the case is, um, he's not sort of accepted into society by his family. He's not accepted by his family. They don't really want to deal with him, so they send him off to a monastery. And in this story, his parents are not necessarily the villains. They are being manipulated by this sort of scheming Catholic priest, which is a character type that shows up a couple of times. And here we see the priest and the Catholic Church operating in a non-spiritual way, in a very political manner. That this priest is trying to exert his control over this noble family, because it gets him riches, it gets him power, it lets him exert himself on things, and this family unit is sort of broken up by this priest. The mother and the father don't really want to send away their illegitimate son. They still kind of like him. His brother eventually tries to save him from the monastery, but this priest, this sort of repressive system, this repressive social system of Catholicism is keeping them from their more humane instincts. This is important. So he is sent to this monastery against his own will, and he's definitely not the type of person who is meant to be a monk. He's quite tormented by this essentially imprisonment in this monastery. He yearns for freedom, and he suffers a great deal. In fact, the suffering in this story is actually probably its most effective element. I think the description of his anguish, of his torment, of his sort of day-to-day situation in this monastery, sort of metaphorically bashing his head against the wall over and over, the sort of psychological torture and isolation he experiences in this place is quite effective. And it actually reminds me a lot of someone like Edgar Allan Poe. And there's a novel I covered a few years ago, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket by Edgar Allan Poe, which similarly deals with suffering, just long descriptions of a man who is basically endlessly cast into situations where he must suffer. This monastery is itself a sort of microcosm of the Catholics' sort of Spanish Inquisition control. The monks are very tightly controlled, but they're not actually spiritual. And the monastery itself, though it has a sort of pseudo-spiritual role in society, is actually being used for political means, and the people within it are not actually focused on their salvation or the salvation of others or acting in a particularly holy way, but instead are focused on their own material gains and basically trying to tolerate this incredibly repressive system that they've been put in. Now, eventually, our hero, the Spanish sailor, gets involved with the Spanish Inquisition due to his sort of inability to mesh with this situation. And this is where he meets Melmoth the Wanderer. So we see that Melmoth is sort of targeting people who are alienated from God. And this Spanish sailor is alienated from God not because of his innate religious nature. There are actually many times in the book when this sailor is shown to have a sort of deep reverence for God, a truly sort of, I wouldn't say holy nature to him, but he prays to God to get him out of this situation, but he feels alienated from God because he's in a society that treats God differently, that does not allow him a personal relationship with God. And this is what makes him a target for Melmoth. Melmoth himself, he's not atheistic. He clearly believes in God. He believes in Satan, at least, and he knows he's going to hell. But he feels that he has been alienated from salvation. Basically, it's his own fault. He made a deal with the devil. I guess he didn't know exactly what he was getting into. At this point, he knows, I've screwed up. I am unavailable for salvation. Salvation is not an option for me. And I need to find people in the same situation and bring them with me, I guess, as a sort of camaraderie. So that is the story of the Spanish sailor. I won't get into much more that happens. That's the main idea. Then we have the story of Emily. Emily is a young girl who was shipwrecked onto an island off the coast of India and basically grows up in this little isolated, solitary Eden. This little paradise of hers. On this island, there's fresh water, there's all these fruits and food around, there's these beautiful birds that sing her songs, and she ends up developing this very keen relationship with nature. But of course, she's never met a single person really in her life. Like she was shipwrecked on this island very, very young, and and when we meet her in the story, she is around 17, I think, late teenager. And Melmoth the Wanderer is in fact the first person she ever meets. Now this seems like the easiest possible mark in the world for Melmoth, because this is probably the most naive human being you will find on the entire planet. And she immediately falls in love with him and wants to talk to him all the time. And these conversations are one of the more interesting aspects of the book. She has developed a relationship with God that is mediated by nature. To her, the birds, the trees, the ground, the stars in the sky, this is her idea of God. And this obviously is not going to fit well with any sort of organized institution of religion. Melmoth, with her, discusses his relationship with religion. While it's somewhat atheistic, essentially it's built out of this hatred. He has a hatred for all forms of Christianity, particularly Catholicism. He also gets into Hinduism and Islam just because they can look across the river and see in India there's these other institutions of religion going on. And he presents his ideas. Now these ideas, and I think this is most obvious because this is written by a religious person. While he does present a form of atheism, it is very much an atheism built out of knowledge of God existing but just not liking it, and feeling that he, as I said before, like he's lost his chance at salvation and now he's mad. He's mad. He's basically envious of religion. Eventually, Emily ends up back in Spain, reunited with her original family, and there she, like the Spanish sailor, has to deal with the incompatibility with her idea of God and the social idea of God in Spain. And so these are two of the people that Melmoth is trying to tempt. And it's actually kind of funny that Melmoth, although he's clearly a very powerful figure, and he's a very charismatic and interesting figure, and the best parts of the book are the parts when he is there, like whenever he enters a scene, it's very interesting. But he doesn't actually do very well in convincing these people that they need to sell their soul to the devil and join him in hell or whatever he wants to do. In fact, part of the reason why he remains such an enigmatic figure is because he doesn't, his goals don't really seem to line up with what he does and what he says and how he converses with these people. And it seems like he almost doesn't want to succeed despite all his efforts. And in this sense, the book leaves us with a very ambiguous idea at the end. It's not a very cut and dry, black and white sort of religious book. There's a lot of gray area here. There's a a sense in which it's very difficult to understand both Melmoth and the people he interacts with. We can obviously see that the book is anti-Catholic, but it's kind of difficult to understand exactly what Charles Maturin would rather us do, what he thinks a effective relationship with God even looks like. We don't really see that in the novel, and I think the novel has quite a lack of resolution. Like I said before, the ending is quite abrupt. We get pulled out of all these stories one after the other, and Melmoth's sort of final days do not give us the insight we want. We're craving to understand Melmoth, and we never quite get to. And this is in fact a good thing. Like, this is what makes a novel like this stick in your mind. If at the end we said, "Oh, Melmoth, he was a bad guy," doop, obviously we wouldn't have much to talk about today. I'd also like to discuss briefly a sort of surprising sequel to this novel that was written about a dozen years later by a very different author. And this was Honoré de Balzac, who is a French author, a very, very famous 19th century French author who wrote a gigantic number of books. And this is one of his lesser known, it's a little novella really, not quite a whole novel. And it's called Melmoth Reconciled. He looked at the lack of success that Melmoth was able to achieve in the original version and decided to think about what would happen if a Melmoth figure descended on 19th century Paris. If you've read any of Balzac, you know that he's an intensely cynical writer, that he does not have a very positive idea about the people living in 19th century Paris, or really France in general. He thinks these people are sort of innately corrupt, and his novels are often about the ways in this corruption affects them. So in his novel, this Melmoth figure comes to Paris and decides, and in this version, the curse is actually kind of different. In this version, once Melmoth has convinced someone to take on his role, to live 150 years and have all these powers, but sell their soul to the devil, at this point he is saved. His curse sort of transfers to the next person. They get to use all their powers and then transfer it to a further person. I didn't get the sense that that was how it worked in the original. I may have missed something there. I may have misunderstood certain aspects. But definitely in Balzac's story, this is how it works. And that's sort of the nature of the comedy of this novel, because Melmoth descends on Paris looking for someone to tempt and immediately finds someone. There's this banker. He's stolen a bunch of money. He wants to run away with his mistress, and Melmoth says, "Hey, you want all these powers. You can do anything you want. You'll be super happy. It'll be great." And the guy's like, "Yeah, okay." Then the guy realizes, I don't really want to go to hell that bad, so he goes to the stock exchange and immediately finds someone and says, "Hey, you want these? If you sell your soul to the devil, you can get a bunch of money. You want to do it?" And the guy says, "Yeah." And so in this novella, basically the curse changes hands about a dozen times over the course of a couple days before the last guy dies or whatever. I don't really remember. This version of the story is a bit more cut and dry, a bit more black and white, not quite as interesting as the original version. Definitely would recommend Melmoth the Wanderer over it, but it's something of an interesting historical curiosity at the very least. And it's always fun to see how a different author will come at the same sort of theme. Balzac's not my favorite, as you might guess. I think he's a bit too cynical for me. But obviously a lot of people like him, and I do enjoy some of his novels. They're not all bad. This one I wouldn't say is his best, but it's kind of funny. So this has been a discussion of Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin. Highly recommended. A supplemental discussion of Melmoth Reconciled by Honoré de Balzac. not particularly recommended. What else do you want? Goodbye.